Welcome to tonight's video on section 2-3, talking about conditional statements. The first conditional statement that we will talk about is what's called an if-then statement. Get the pens here. If-then statements. There we go. If-then statements are a form of if P is true, then Q is the conclusion. The hypothesis is basically the statement is the phrase immediately following the word if. That is like what you will do, and then the conclusion of the conditional statement is the phrase that immediately follows the word then. So for example, if a polygon has 6 sides, so a polygon having 6 sides, this is the hypothesis. The conclusion is it is a hexagon. So the conclusion to that is a hexagon. So that is the conclusion. All right. The hypothesis of conclusion here is Tamika will advance to the next level of play if she completes the maze in her computer game. So she completes the maze in her computer game is the hypothesis. The conclusion is that Tamika will advance to the next level of play if she does that. All right. So then if you look here at the next statement, if you are a baby, then you will cry. So you are a baby is the hypothesis. The conclusion is you will cry. And that will be B. Next one, to find the distance between 2 points, you can use the distance formula. So basically the hypothesis is that you want to find the hypothesis is, did I just erase? The hypothesis is that you want to find the distance between 2 points. That's the hypothesis. The conclusion is you'll use the distance formula, and that's A. All right. So now it wants you to write it in if-then form. So if distance is measured, then it is positive. That is if-then form. Here's another one. If a polygon has 5 sides, then it is a polygon or a pentagon. All right, so then the next one you have, it says if a polygon with 8 sides is an octagon. So if you were to say if a polygon has 8 sides, then it is an octagon B. Here an angle that measures 45 degrees is an acute angle. You could say if an angle is acute, or if an angle measures 45 degrees, then it is acute. C. All right. So here we're talking about when is the conditional statement true or false? If the hypothesis is true and the conclusion is true, then the conditional is true. If Tom does finish his homework, he does clean his room. If the hypothesis is true and the conclusion is false, then the conditional is false. If he finishes his homework but he doesn't clean his room after it, then that is a false statement. If the hypothesis is false but the conclusion is true, then the conditional is true. Same with the hypothesis false, and the conditional is false, or the conclusion is false, then the conditional is true. A conditional is false only when the conclusion is false and the hypothesis is true. When a hypothesis is false, the conditional will always be true. So it wants you to determine the truth value. Determine the truth value of the conditional statement. So if you subtract a whole number from another whole number, the result is also a whole number. Well, it's true, you can do that, but that is false. And the counterexample is 2 minus 5 equals negative 3, because remember, that's an integer, not a whole number. All right, determine the truth value here. If last month was February, then this month is March. That is true, since March follows February. The next one, when a rectangle has an obtuse angle, it is a parallelogram. That is true, because notice the hypothesis is false. Whenever the hypothesis is false, it is always true. False, since a rectangle will never have an obtuse angle. All right, so the next one, determine the truth value of the conditional statement. If true, explain your reasoning. The product of whole numbers is greater than or equal to 0. That is true. If you have two whole numbers, it's greater than or equal to 0, because remember, whole numbers are only positive. All right, if yesterday was Tuesday, then today is Monday. That is false. If yesterday was Tuesday, then today is Wednesday. If a triangle has 4 right angles, then it is a rectangle. That is true, because the hypothesis is false. So therefore, a conditional with a false hypothesis is always true. All right, then conditional statements like the converse. The converse is basically when you switch the hypothesis and conclusion. The inverse is when you negate both the hypothesis and conclusion. And the contrapositive is when you basically take the converse of the inverse. You switch them. Now, logically equivalent. The conditional and contrapositive are logically equivalent, meaning they'll both either be true or false. The converse and inverse are also logically equivalent. So, for example, here, if you write a conditional statement, if an animal is a bat, then it can fly. That's your conditional. That's true. Bats are animals and they can fly. The converse, if an animal can fly, so basically switch the hypothesis and conclusion, then it is a bat. That is false. The counterexample to that would be a bird. is an animal that can fly and is not a bat. The inverse of that would basically be if you negate the conditional. So if an animal is not a bat, then it cannot fly. And that is false as well. Counterexample to that is once again a bird is not a bat but can fly. And the contrapositive, if an animal cannot fly, then it is not a bat, and that is true. So notice the conditional and contrapositive are both true. The converse and inverse are false. Remember, they should be logically the same. All right, let's look at this last one here. Write the converse and inverse and contrapositive statement. The sum of the measures of two complementary angles is 90. So the conditional would be if the sum of the measures of two angles is 90 degrees, then the angles are complementary. That is true. Converse, if two angles are complementary, then the sum of the measures of the two angles is 90. That is true. If two angles are complementary, their sum is 90. The inverse, if the sum of two angles is not 90 degrees, then the two angles are not complementary. And that is true. And then last but not least, the contrapositive, if two angles are not complementary, then their sum is not 90 degrees. And that is true. So notice all four statements here are true. So A is true. All right, I hope you found the video useful and you have a good evening.